Elena Cross had audited 11 companies in 6 years, and not one of them had ever sent their CEO to greet her in the lobby. Voss Holdings did. He was already standing when the elevator opened onto the 40th floor, tall, dark-suited, unreadable in the particular way of men who had learned early that stillness reads as power. Dante Voss didn't offer his hand right away. He watched her cross the marble floor first, the way you'd watch weather roll in, deciding whether it was worth adjusting your plans for. "Ms. Cross," he said, "I read your file." "I read yours too," Elena said. "It's longer than mine." Something in his mouth almost moved. Almost. She wasn't here for pleasantries. Voss Holdings had been flagged for a compliance audit tied to a city infrastructure contract, the kind of routine, unglamorous review that happened to any firm with a history like this one, mafia-adjacent for 3 generations, now scrubbing itself toward legitimacy one contract at a time. Elena's job was simple. Pull the ledgers, trace the money, sign or don't sign. She'd done it 100 times. She didn't need an escort, and she definitely didn't need charm. But charm was what she got. 20 minutes into the opening meeting, Dante began, smoothly, to narrow her scope. These entities are outside the contract's relevant window. This subsidiary reports separately and isn't material to your review. I'd recommend focusing your first pass here. And he slid a folder toward her, already tabbed, already organized, already deciding for her what she'd find. Elena had seen this exact move before. Not from him. From a lawyer 11 years ago, in a much smaller conference room, sliding a folder toward her father with the same unhurried confidence, the same "I'd recommend," right before her father signed something that put him in a cell for 6 years for a crime he didn't commit. She stood up mid-sentence, while Dante was still talking, and picked up her bag. "I'll build my own scope," she said. "Thank you for the folder." She was at the elevator before anyone in the room had fully processed that she'd left. Behind the glass wall, she watched Dante's executive team turn to him, waiting for a reaction, the kind of reaction a man like him was supposed to have when someone walked out on him in his own building. He didn't chase her. He just watched the elevator doors close, his expression doing something none of them had a name for. CTA point, type, subscribe prompt sample. If you've ever walked out on someone who thought charm would work on you, subscribe, because Elena's about to find out charm was never Dante's real weapon. By the time Elena got back to her own office, her phone was already lit up with 4 missed calls from Richard Ames, managing partner of Ames Cole, the man who'd hired her fresh out of school and mentored her into the auditor she was now. She called him back from her desk, bracing for a lecture. "The Voss account is worth $11 million a year to this firm," Richard said, not shouting, which was worse. "You walked out of the opening meeting. You tried to narrow my scope before I'd even seen the full ledger." A pause. Then, strangely, Richard's voice softened. "Good," he said. "Don't let him redirect you. Do it exactly the way you do it for anyone else." A beat. "I trust you, Elena. I always have." It should have felt like relief. It felt, faintly, like something she couldn't name yet. That night, in her apartment, Elena did what she always did when a case reminded her of her father. She opened the drawer under her bed and took out the box. Case files, yellowed at the corners, held together with rubber bands that had lost most of their stretch. A newspaper clipping, folded so many times the crease had worn through the paper. Local financier convicted in fraud scheme. She'd read it so many times she could recite it. She still didn't believe a word of it. She wasn't poor. She wasn't desperate. She had a nice apartment and a title and a reputation for being the one person in her firm who couldn't be talked out of anything. But every audit she'd ever taken, every ledger she'd ever traced to its last decimal point, was a small, private rehearsal for the justice nobody had given her father. Her mother had remarried 2 years after the conviction, moved to another state, stopped mentioning her first husband's name at family gatherings until eventually there weren't family gatherings that included Elena at all. Elena didn't blame her, not really. Grief made people build new lies out of self-preservation, and her mother had simply built hers faster than Elena had been willing to. What Elena had built instead was a career that let her keep looking quietly for the version of the system that might have worked the way it was supposed to if only someone patient enough had been looking at the right numbers at the right time. She'd never found it. Not once, in 6 years, had an audit turned up anything that connected back to her father's case. She didn't know yet that this one would. She didn't know yet that this particular audit was about to become the real thing. The next morning, before she'd even had coffee, Dante Voss was standing outside her office building, alone, no security, holding a file folder she recognized instantly because it was identical to the one locked in the drawer under her bed. He was leaning against the building's stone facade like he'd been there for hours, which, Elena would later learn, he had. No security detail, no assistant, just him and a manila folder that had no business being in his hands. "You're in a background check on me," Elena said, before he could speak. "I run a background check on everyone assigned to my accounts." His voice was flat, not defensive. "Standard. I do it before I meet them, not after." He held up the folder slightly. This wasn't standard. Elena's jaw tightened. "That's my father's case." "I know. You don't get to know that." "I didn't go looking for it," Dante said. "It came up because your name is attached to it. Character witness testimony, age 19. You try to get a continuance filed. It didn't work." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse, like he'd simply read a fact off a page instead of aiming a weapon. Elena felt the old fury rise, fast and clean, the same fury that had made her stand up mid-sentence the day before. This was the move. This was exactly the move. Dig up someone's worst wound and dangle it, quietly, as leverage, the way the lawyer had dangled her father's fear of a longer sentence to get him to sign a plea that admitted to something he hadn't done. CTA point. Type. Comment bait question sample. Would you have let him finish talking, or is "I know why you walked out" already game over? Tell me in the comments. "I'm not threatening you," Dante said, reading her face correctly. "I'm telling you why I need you specifically. Someone inside my own company has been feeding falsified numbers to regulators, sabotaging the exact contract you're supposed to be auditing. I need someone running these books who can't be bought, redirected, or scared off. Yesterday, in about 90 seconds, you proved you're all three." Elena didn't believe him. Couldn't afford to. That's the same story every corrupt organization tells the person auditing them. Someone else did it. "I don't need you to believe me," Dante said. "I need you to keep doing exactly what you're already doing. No rerote. No tabs, no folders, no recommended starting points. Pull whatever you want, in whatever order you want." He left before she could answer, which unsettled her more than if he'd pushed. She was used to men pushing. She wasn't used to men leaving the door open and walking away from it. She went back to her scope that day, cold and by the book, refusing every offer of assistance his office made. It was, she told herself, simply professional diligence. It didn't feel like professional diligence. It felt like watching someone very carefully to see if the mask would slip and being unnerved every hour that it didn't. Miles away, in an office with no name on the door, a man neither of them had met yet reviewed a printed copy of the Voss Holdings audit assignment sheet, Elena's name circled twice in red pen, and made a phone call that would not be traced back to him for another 7 chapters. That evening, pulling the very first ledger from the file room, Elena found a discrepancy in the account routing, and it didn't point to Voss Holdings at all. It pointed to Ames Cole, her own firm. She checked it 4 times before she let herself believe it. The falsified entries she'd been sent to find weren't originating inside Voss Holdings books. They were routed through an intermediary account, one that belonged, on paper, to her own firm. Ames Cole wasn't just auditing the fraud. Ames Cole's account numbers were laundering it. Elena sat with that for a long time before she decided what to do with it. The obvious move was to bring it to Richard. The obvious move was also, suddenly, the one she trusted least. She brought it to Dante instead. He didn't gloat. That was the first thing she noticed. No "I told you so," no satisfaction at being proven right about the mole inside her firm. He just looked at the numbers for a long time, jaw working, and said, "This is worse than I thought. Someone's using my company's reputation as cover. Everyone already assumes Voss Holdings launders money, so nobody looks twice when it actually happens through an account with our name loosely attached, as long as the real source stays hidden behind a firm nobody suspects. Yours. CTA point. Type. Like engagement prompt sample. Elena just chose the mafia boss over her own firm because the numbers didn't lie. Like this if you'd have made the same call. It was, Elena would realize later, the first conversation between them that wasn't a negotiation. He wasn't trying to redirect her, wasn't trying to buy her silence, wasn't trying to charm her into anything. He was simply telling her what he saw, plainly, and letting her decide what to do with it. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. The next day, she went to Richard's office and, carefully, without accusing him of anything, mentioned the routing discrepancy. She watched his face. He didn't flinch exactly, but there was a half-second delay before he said, "I'll look into it personally, don't worry about that end," that hadn't been there in any conversation she'd had with him in 6 years. It wasn't proof of anything. It was just a crack. The first one. She went home that night and didn't open her father's box. For the first time in years, she didn't need to. The wound didn't feel like ancient history anymore. It felt current, active, like something that had never actually stopped happening, and she was only now catching up to it in real time. She stood at her window a long while, looking down at the street, and thought about how strange it was that the man she'd walked out on 2 days earlier was the only person in her orbit who hadn't tried to manage her reaction to anything. Richard managed. The lawyer who'd handled her father's plea had managed. Even her own instincts, most days, were a kind of management, smoothing her face into something professional before anyone could see what she actually felt. Dante hadn't asked her to smooth anything. He'd simply put the truth on the table and let her have whatever reaction she needed to have. It bothered her how much that mattered. It bothered her more that she couldn't stop turning it over. The next morning, before Elena had even logged into her email, Richard Ames pulled her off the Voss account entirely, citing, in a 2-line memo, an unspecified conflict of interest. It had been less than 24 hours since she'd shown him the discrepancy. The memo was 2 sentences long and somehow said nothing at all. Effective immediately, Elena Cross is reassigned from the Voss Holdings engagement. Please direct all client communications to Senior Partner Review. No explanation. No appeal process listed, though she knew there technically was one. One that would take months and require exactly the kind of political capital she didn't have, not against Richard Ames. This was worse than a threat, worse than anything physical. This was her professional life being dismantled through channels so legitimate she couldn't even point to a single rule that had been broken. Nobody had touched her. Nobody had said a cruel word. They'd simply, quietly, taken away the one thing that let her keep working her father's case without anyone knowing that's what she was doing. She half expected Dante to fix it. A man with his resources could make one phone call and have her reinstated by lunch. He didn't call. When she finally reached him, voice tight with a fury she was directing at the wrong person, he said something that surprised her more than a rescue would have. "If I intervene, it confirms every suspicion your firm already has that you're compromised, that you're working for me instead of auditing me. That helps neither of us." A pause. "If you want back in, you'll have to find your own leverage. I'll give you anything you need to build it, but it has to be yours. CTA point. Type. Subscribe prompt sample." He didn't rescue her. He told her to fight her own way back in. Subscribe if you respect that more than a bailout. Elena spent the next 2 days doing the only thing she knew how to do when she was furious and locked out of official channels. She went back to her father's box. She'd read every page of that case 100 times, but she'd never had a live, active fraud scheme to lay next to it before. Never had a second data set to cross-reference the first against. She spread both sets of account numbers across her kitchen table, decade-old and current, side by side, looking for anything, expecting nothing. She found the account number at 2 a.m., her coffee gone cold beside her. It matched. Exactly. Digit for digit, the routing account from her father's decade-old conviction and the account currently laundering money through her firm's name into Voss Holdings compliance reports were the same account. This wasn't 2 unrelated frame jobs separated by 10 years. This was one operation patient enough to run for a decade, and she had just found the thread that connected both ends of it. She thought, briefly, absurdly, of calling Richard, the instinct of 6 years of trusting him with every discovery she'd ever made. She caught herself before she picked up the phone. That instinct, she realized, was exactly the kind of thing a patient operation counted on. The assumption that the person who'd always been safe would go on being safe forever, simply because he always had been. She set the phone down and, for the first time since she'd started at Ames Cole, didn't call her mentor with what she'd found. She called no one. She sat with it alone until the sky outside her kitchen window went from black to gray, turning the two account numbers over and over, daring them to stop matching. They never did. Elena stared at the two files side by side on her kitchen table until sunrise, unable to look away from a single impossible fact. The same account number, 10 years apart, in two cases that were never supposed to touch. She didn't call ahead. She drove straight to Dante's house, still in yesterday's clothes, and stood on his doorstep at 7 in the morning, holding both files against her chest like they might get away from her. He opened the door himself. Whatever he saw on her face made him step back and let her in without a single question. She laid both files on his kitchen counter, side by side, the way she had on her own table hours earlier, and watched him go still in a way she hadn't seen from him before. Not the practiced stillness of the boardroom, something raw. This handwriting, Dante said, one finger against a margin note on the decade-old file, voice quieter than she'd heard it. I know this handwriting. Whose is it? Marcos Felt. He said the name like it cost him something. My father's second in command. He orchestrated the transition that put me in charge at 26, officially a promotion. Unofficially, my father was dead 6 months later, and nobody in the organization has ever been allowed to ask how exactly that happened. CTA point, type, comment bait question sample. Her father and his father, destroyed by the same man, 10 years apart. Comment if you saw that coming before Chapter 5. Elena sat down slowly at his kitchen table, the fury she'd been carrying for 6 years reorganizing itself into something new. Not less, just differently shaped. Dante wasn't the danger she'd assumed him to be on day one. He was a man who'd spent a decade holding together an organization with one hand while trying to walk it into legitimacy with the other, all while the man who'd engineered his father's downfall still sat comfortably somewhere inside his own house. I always told myself the coldness was inherited, Dante said, not quite looking at her. Something in the blood. It's not. It's just, this is what's left after you spend 10 years making sure nobody gets close enough to use against you the way he used my father. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He said it the way she'd told him about her own father, plainly, without spin, without turning it into a justification for anything he'd done. Elena didn't move toward him, but she didn't leave, either, and for two people who had built entire identities around never staying anywhere they didn't have to, that quiet decision to remain in the same kitchen, over cold coffee at 7 in the morning, was its own kind of intimacy. In a cutaway neither of them witnessed, a man in a car 3 blocks away made a call. She's found the connection, he said, not to Dante's security, to someone watching Elena. It took Elena 2 days to notice the same gray sedan outside her building 3 mornings running. It took her one more to realize it wasn't trying to hide. That was the unsettling part, not the surveillance itself, but the precision of it. Whoever was watching her wanted to be noticed. It was a message, not an ambush. She told Dante immediately, expecting the response she'd have gotten from any man in his position. A security detail assigned without her consent, a car she hadn't asked for, decisions made for her safety that were really decisions made for his comfort. Instead, he asked her a question first. Do you want protection, he said, or do you want me to stay out of your physical safety entirely and only help you with the case? I won't assume which one. Tell me. CTA point, type, share prompt sample. He asked permission before protecting her. Share this if that's rarer in this genre than it should be. It was such a simple question, and it landed harder than any grand gesture could have. Elena thought about it for a long moment before answering. Minimal, she finally said. On my terms. I choose the schedule. I choose who. Done. That was it. No argument. No, but it's safer if no override disguised as concern. He gave her exactly what she'd asked for and nothing more. And something in Elena's chest, something that had been braced for a fight, unclenched. While Elena adjusted to the quiet, careful presence of a driver she'd approved herself, Marcus Feld paid a visit to Richard Ames's office, 30 floors above the street, in a meeting that no calendar recorded. Feld didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply reminded Richard, in the mild, procedural tone of a man discussing quarterly numbers, of exactly how long their arrangement had been running and exactly how little Richard's current discomfort mattered compared to that history. This wasn't a man recently turned. This was a rooted, decade-long compromise, finally under pressure. And pressure, everyone in that room understood, made men do desperate things. Elena, 3 floors below her own apartment that same evening, felt for the first time in weeks like she might actually be safe. It was a strange kind of safety, one she hadn't experienced since before her father's trial. Not the absence of danger, exactly, but the presence of someone whose competence she could actually rely on. She caught herself, standing at her stove making a late dinner, thinking about the specific way Dante had asked her a question instead of making a decision for her, and how rare that it turned out to be in her life. Her father had never gotten that kind of respect from the system that convicted him. She hadn't expected to find a version of it here. Of all places, from a man whose family had built its fortune on exactly the kind of unaccountable power that respect was supposed to be the opposite of. She came home to find her apartment untouched. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, except her father's case file, left open on her kitchen table to the one page that mattered, photographed and returned exactly where she'd left it. A robbery, she could have understood. This was worse. Someone had been in her home, moved nothing, taken nothing, and left her father's file open to the exact page, the account routing number, that had started all of this. It wasn't theft. It was a message. We know what you know, and we know exactly where you keep it. Elena called Dante with a steadiness in her voice that she didn't actually feel, and within the hour she was at his house again, not asking this time whether it was appropriate, simply needing somewhere that didn't feel violated. They worked through the night, not as protector and protected, as 2 people who'd both spent a decade building cases nobody else believed, finally doing it together, out loud, with someone who understood exactly what each discovery cost. Dante pulled his organization's old internal records. Elena cross-referenced them against her father's file with the same exacting patience she brought to every audit she'd ever run. Coffee went cold twice. Somewhere around 3 a.m., they were both laughing, actually laughing briefly, disbelievingly, at the sheer absurdity of Marcus Feld's paper trail, a man so confident in his own untouchability that he'd barely bothered to hide it. CTA point, type, watch time next part, T sample. They're about to find the one document Marcus Feld never thought anyone would connect back to him. Don't skip the next part. It was near dawn, both of them exhausted in the particular way that strips people down to something more honest than they intend, when the room went quiet in a different way. Dante was close enough that she could have closed the distance in half a second. She almost did. She pulled back first. I don't know how to trust anyone whose world runs on the same rules that destroyed my father, she said, and it wasn't an accusation, just the plainest truth she had. Dante didn't argue, didn't push, didn't try to convince her she was wrong about him. He just nodded and let the distance stay exactly where she'd put it. And that restraint, that refusal to close a gap she wasn't ready to close herself, did more for her than any declaration could have. Take whatever time you need, he said, standing to make more coffee instead of moving closer. I'm not going anywhere. Not because I'm waiting for something from you, because this is my life too now. Feld doesn't get to take that away from either of us a second time. It was such a small promise, wrapped in the mundane act of refilling a coffee pot, and it landed harder in Elena's chest than anything more dramatic could have. She watched him at the counter, his back to her, giving her the privacy to compose herself without making a show of it, and thought that this, the ordinary, unglamorous decency of it, was somehow more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart than anything he could have said with his hands on her face. Her phone rang at 9 the next morning. Richard Ames, warm, reassuring, offering to quietly reinstate her on the Voss account, an offer that, after everything, should have felt like relief. It felt like something closing around her instead. Elena accepted, but not the way old Elena would have, gratefully, relieved to be back in her mentor's good graces. New Elena accepted the way she now accepted everything, as a document to be read twice before signing. The reinstatement paperwork came with an attachment she almost missed, a single directive buried in procedural language, instructing her to specifically clear one Shell account from further scrutiny. A courtesy exception, the memo called it. Standard practice for accounts under a certain threshold. It was the same account, the one connecting her father's decade-old case to the fraud currently running through Voss Holdings. If she signed off, she'd become legally complicit in exactly the kind of fraud that had convicted her father, using her own credibility to launder the same lie a second time. If she refused, Richard would frame her insubordination as instability, and her career, the one thing she'd built entirely on her own, would take the damage instead. CTA point. Type. Like engagement prompt sample. She's being asked to sign the same kind of lie that destroyed her father. Like this, if you already know, she's not going to sign it. She didn't confront Richard first. She brought it to Dante, and together, laying the Shell account's history next to everything else they'd already assembled, they realized the full shape of it. This account wasn't just the mechanism Marcus Feld had used for a decade. It was the very account Richard Ames himself had signed off on 10 years ago in the filing that convicted her father. This wasn't new corruption. This was the same act, repeated, with Elena herself now cast, unknowingly, until this exact moment, in the role of the person meant to make it look clean. She thought, for a moment, about not confronting him at all, about simply resigning quietly, walking away from Ames Cole and everything it had once meant to her, the way it would have been easiest to do. But easiest had never been the point. Her father hadn't gotten the chance to confront the people who'd build a case against him out of nothing. The system had simply closed around him before he understood what was happening. Elena wasn't going to let this close around her the same way, silently, without anyone in the room having to say the truth out loud. She went to Richard's office alone. She didn't raise her voice. She'd learned, somewhere in the last few weeks, that she didn't need to. "You signed the account that convicted my father," she said, "and now you wanted to clear it again." Richard didn't deny it. That was almost the worst part. He didn't even try. That's how the business always worked. "Elena," he said, tired rather than ashamed, a man explaining gravity to someone who should already understand it. "You survive by knowing which accounts to look past. I taught you everything else. I assumed I'd taught you that too, eventually." Elena walked out of his office without another word. Behind a closing door, Richard picked up his desk phone and made one call, to Marcus Feld, warning him that Elena knows everything now. Marcus Feld had run his operation quietly for a decade. Quiet stopped being an option the moment Richard's warning reached him. He found Elena 3 days later, not in an alley, not in a parking garage, but at a public city hearing on the infrastructure contract, in front of officials, press, and half of Voss Holdings board, exactly where an accusation would do the most damage in the least amount of time. He approached her during a recess, calm, composed, holding a folder of his own, a doctored version of her father's file, edited just enough to suggest that Elena's testimony today was compromised by old, unresolved bias. "Say one word about that account," Feld said, quiet enough that only she could hear, and this goes to every reporter in that room in the next 5 minutes. CTA point. Type. Subscribe prompt sample. He's trying to destroy her the same way he destroyed her father, in front of everyone. Subscribe before the next part. You don't want to miss how she answers him. Dante arrived before she had to answer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't bring men with him, didn't threaten Feld with anything a decade-old version of himself might have. He walked to the hearing's official record desk and, calmly, publicly submitted the real, unaltered file himself. The decade-old case, the current fraud, the matching account number, laid out for the record in front of everyone Feld had been counting on to believe the doctored version instead. It wasn't retaliation. It was exposure. The legal system doing, in real time, exactly what it had failed to do for both their fathers, this time because someone had finally handed it the truth instead of folder built to obscure it. Feld was detained within the hour, not by Dante's people, but by the actual officials present for the hearing, a small, deliberate distinction that mattered more to Dante than Elena initially understood. He wasn't interested in being the man who solved this with violence. He was interested in being the man who didn't have to. Elena watched the board members around her shift, visibly, from suspicion to something closer to respect, watched a decade of assumptions about the Voss name loosen in real time, in front of press who would print exactly what they'd witnessed instead of the version Feld had come prepared to plant. It was, she understood, the single most effective thing Dante could have done for his company's future, and he'd done it not as a calculated business move, but because it was, simply, the right way to end this. She wasn't sure she'd ever watched someone choose the harder, slower, more exposing path over the easier one. In real time, for no audience but the truth itself. As Feld was let out, he leaned close enough to say something to Dante that no one else in the room heard. Elena watched Dante's face change. Not fear, not anger, something stiller and stranger. And she realized, for the first time since she'd met him, that there was something even he didn't already know the answer to. He told her that night, sitting across from her at his kitchen table, in the same spot where they'd first laid 2 decade-apart files side by side. Feld said Richard wasn't his only source at your firm, Dante said. He said he arranged, years ago, to make sure you specifically got assigned to your father's case as the whistleblower's witness. That he groomed you into exactly the kind of incorruptible auditor he'd eventually need, decades later, to unravel his own operation from the inside, without ever knowing you were the tool. Elena sat with that for a long moment. It was the kind of claim that could unmake a person if she let it, the idea that even her defining wound, the thing that had shaped every choice she'd made since she was 19, might have been engineered by the very man who'd caused it. She didn't know, in the end, whether to believe him. Feld had every reason to say something devastating on his way out the door, true or not, just to leave one more wound behind him. Dante didn't try to resolve it for her, didn't offer a comforting answer he couldn't actually give. He let it sit, unanswered, the way some things simply had to. CTA point, type, comment bait question sample. Was her whole career actually his design? Or was that Feld's last lie? Tell me what you think happened. What Elena did know, with a certainty that surprised her, was what she wanted next. Voss Holdings had come out of the hearing with its legitimacy more solid than it had been in a decade. The very thing Feld had spent years trying to sabotage, now stronger because of the sabotage itself. She was offered and accepted a permanent position as in-house counsel overseeing the company's ongoing legal transition. Not a rescue, not charity. A job she was, by every objective measure, the best qualified person in the city to do. Dante didn't make it a grand declaration. He simply said, one evening, reviewing the first fully clean ledger Voss Holdings had ever produced, that he wasn't interested in her only professionally, and that he suspected she already knew that, and that he was in no hurry for her to say anything back until she meant it. She didn't say anything back that night. She didn't need to. She stayed at the table instead, going over numbers with him until well past midnight. And for 2 people who had spent their whole lives being unable to stay anywhere they didn't have to, that was its own answer. Later, when she finally did say something back, not that night, not the next week, but on an evening weeks after, when the clean ledger had become a dozen clean ledgers and the surveillance detail outside her building had long since been dismissed, it wasn't a declaration either. It was simply her key, set down on his kitchen counter next to his, without either of them making a production of what that meant. Some things she'd learned from him didn't need to be announced to be real. They just needed to still be there in the morning. Weeks later, at that same table, Dante slid a second folder across to her. New, unopened, a case with no name on it yet, and said only that was the first one he'd ever brought to her instead of the other way around.